Several African countries are currently engaged in negotiations over critical minerals, with the recent deal brokered by the US between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo serving as a notable example. The question is, how can Africa navigate this complex landscape to their advantage? Well, we have Chris Vandome, an expert in resource governance from Chatham House, with us to discuss this. Hi, Chris. So nice of you to join us.
Morning, Linda. Good to see you.
You know, that's the word at the moment in Africa, critical minerals, and how can it be leveraged for Africa?
We're opening up a huge area of conversation here that not a lot of people have a particularly deep handle on. So, let's start at first principles. One of the reasons for these conversations around critical minerals is this idea of what is critical. Now, this started really as a push from consumer nations, particularly the US, the EU, the UK, into what do we view as being critical for our economic utilization further down the supply chain. So, and particularly around the green energy transition. So what do we need in order to be able to have a global green transition? We're going to need a lot of copper. We're going to need lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, manganese, and so on. And then saying, okay, well, out of these materials that we need, where are there problems and supply chain risks? Where is it that there are choke points? Where is it that we think that there's an over-concentration of processing or of production? And that's how consumer nations ended up with this idea of we have identified these as being critical for our economies and our future energy generation. Now, on the flip side, African countries have said, well, actually, hold on. What you see as critical isn't necessarily what we see as critical, because what we see as critical isn't really about global energy transition and the utilization for renewable energy generation. What we see as critical is things that are going to provide human development, economic transformation, jobs on the continent and within our economies. So we are going to create our own vision of what we see as critical. So within these debates, we have this bit of a tussle between what do consumers and producers consider to be critical. Now, why is it that global consumers view some of these as critical? Well, like I said, it's around choke points and it's around overconcentration of processing in particular in China. China has in the past cut off supply of rare earth elements for other Asian economies, including South Korea and Japan, where they're utilized for manufacture of high-end electronic goods. More recently, they've controlled the export of rare earth elements, partly as a means of constricting the economic manufacture of other countries, and this is kind of the economic weaponization of their rare earth element exports. This is what a number of countries are particularly concerned about, is, how do we stop China being able to do this? The piece of the jigsaw that is missing and that's really important for Africa around all of this is that China got itself into a dominant position on the processing side of many of these critical minerals and rare earth elements, not because it wanted to build a geopolitical strategic position and hold over them that it could weaponize in terms of its exports. What it needed was inputs into what has been decades of very high growth rates in an economy that has become one of the world's largest economies with one of the world's largest populations, and it needed inputs to fuel that. And in order to have those inputs and take the inputs and make them into, materials that are useful for manufacturing, it needed to have that processing. It went through a long period of the subsidization of that processing. This was not something that it was able to do overnight. It's not something that is particularly cost effective, and is actually incredibly difficult to make processing of raw materials economically viable. China did this partly because it was the demand for these materials. It was demanding huge amounts of copper, lithium, and so on as part of its national development story. Where does Africa fit into this? Africa was a source of the raw materials. So where China had expanded its domestic mining industry, it was expanding processing at a faster rate. It needed raw materials to go in. And so Africa got linked into the supply of these minerals. Now, when the US, the EU, and others are trying to eliminate or reduce China and their reliance on China within their own supply chains, they're looking at the same sources of these materials, these same producing countries, and saying, hey, rather than export to China, why not export here? Now, as I said, huge subsidies and long time horizons gave China the position that it had. What the West is trying to do is trying to replicate that, but very, very quickly in a way that's trying to win a pick rather than let the market decide, what's going to be successful and what isn't. And ultimately, African countries are left in a position of, well, we've got these countries we've got China, who are continuing to import a large amount of our materials. Chinese growth rates are diminishing, but it's still strong growth in China. That's still kind of a big pull and a big market factor. But there are conversations around, well, what happens when, Chinese demand reduces? Similarly, they're looking at Western countries and saying, well, these countries are saying now that they want our raw materials, but what are they prepared to pay for them? And are they willing to offer Africa something beyond just export? Are they willing to put processing capacity in country? And as I said, these are areas of the supply chain that don't make a huge amount of money. It's very, very difficult for them to be economically viable. So the ask is almost a sense of, will you subsidize and will you support our industry and the bits of the supply chain that don't make money? Will you be able to do that for us so that the supply chain as a whole can create an ecosystem of development? And that's a really big ask from countries who still, in other areas of their foreign policy, haven't nailed their colors to one mast or the other, and are trying to pursue a much more non-aligned foreign policy. It's a big ask to then say to Western countries, okay, you help us, develop these value chains for you. You come in and help with the infrastructure, help with the energy, and help with what we need. But at the same time, we can't guarantee that whatever gets produced at the end is going to get exported to you, or going to go and get exported to China. So yes, there are opportunities on the African continent. There's opportunities in mining. There's a real need for an increase in exploration. Huge opportunities around that. Huge opportunities in kind of clustering some of these approaches, where you've got areas where you will have maybe, copper, nickel, cobalt, gold, polymetallurgical deposits all in a similar area, perhaps straddling a border. How is it that we can, get countries to work together with unified or similar regulatory environments so that companies will come in and invest at scale to be able to produce some of this that then creates the jobs and that then supports the wider ecosystem?
Chris, so we know the United States has shown a clear interest in Africa's mineral wealth. What other countries are actively courting the continent?
There's a lot of interest from international countries and international organizations in Africa, and their means of approach differs across them all. So let's take the US, for example, which you've mentioned. There are several ways in which the US is trying to engage on Africa around critical minerals at the moment. Under the Biden administration, we had the creation of the Mineral Security Partnership. So this being a multilateral organization pretty much set up by predominantly G7 members with a shared interest around the securitization of mineral supply chains, wanting to move the concentration away from China, each acknowledging that they couldn't do it alone. So how were they going to do it? Let's do it through partnership. And you have the creation of the Mineral Security Partnership, which has been quite active in Africa, using mining indaba as a way to engage with countries at a multilateral level. So that's one way, which is this kind of, let's create these new clubs. Let's create these new ways of talking to each other and sharing resources that aren't China. So that's one way the Americans have done it. Another way is through support, for instance, for the Zambia DRC electric vehicle production, electric vehicle battery production agreement. So they've engaged with these bilateral, intracontinental bilateral agreements where the Americans have come in and underpinned it. They've also engaged through things like stockpiling. So there are American companies out stockpiling materials from Africa. Under the Biden administration, there was an organization called Prosper Africa, which was linking 17 different entities in the US to try and coordinate investments on the continent. And then more latterly, we've seen things like the bilateral or the conversations around the agreements with Rwanda and DRC. Now, this is around what we call 3 Ts, which is tin, tantalum, and tungsten, of which the deposits straddle that DRC-Rwanda border. And particularly for things like tungsten, that region is producing, and probably one of the 4th largest regions producing this material after North Korea, China, and Russia. And so you can see why this is of interest for the US. What would an agreement mean is very, very difficult to say at this point. The areas in which the US is seeking to place investment are very, very complicated. That have been run by conflict actors for a very long time, have flitted between being under government control and non-government actor control, and where in the aftermath of some of the peace agreements, when you read what's going on at the moment, there's a lot of criminal activity. There's a lot of kind of, where does warlordism end and gangsterism begin, and so on. And so these are really complicated environments into which the US is potentially looking to invest. So that's going to come with all sorts of complications for, how do you do that? How do you put in place international standards around security? How do you work with state security actors in a way that's productive, providing security not just to the site, but also to the population? So this is the kind of the hard end of this American approach, is really trying to open up and provide for investment into what we would call conflict-affected and high-risk areas in a way to secure minerals that they aren't able to secure from elsewhere. But, mapping out all of this American approach, of course, there are other ways in which they're hedging. So the US has an agreement with Saudi Arabia, for example, and Saudi Arabia has been very keen to reinvest oil rents into critical minerals processing and set itself up as a potential alternative to China in terms of concentration of processing. And this would also help the Americans via that partnership. So you can see that, there are these bilateral partnerships. There are the multilateral partnerships. There are these different prongs of engagement. But there are also these kind of hedges of like, we will try our approach, but also the Saudis are investing in this. And they've got things like the Future Minerals Forum, which gathers many mining ministers from across the continent every year in Saudi Arabia for a conversation around this. So, we can do some of it bilaterally, we can do some of it with others, and we can do some of it kind of in partnership with third parties who will also be a conduit for access. Now, talk through the American approach in quite some depth, because, if you compare that to the way in which the UK or the European Union is operating at the moment, they are much further behind. They haven't adopted this kind of multi-pronged approach yet. What the European Union has got is the Critical Raw Materials Act, which has got targets for domestic processing within the European Union. And then there's a gap there where there is some ability for processing outside. They do want to bring materials from outside. They are listing projects in Africa as strategic projects. So there are some projects which would be said, okay, this is a strategic project. They get, faster permitting, they get European support, and so on. They also have the EU Global Gateway as a financing mechanism to try and crowd in financing, and the European Investment Bank. But what they haven't quite worked out yet is we can't invest directly in the mining industry in terms of mining companies. What can we invest in the wider ecosystem, and which partners can we draw into that wider ecosystem so that we can create economic conditions that are conducive for mining And we've put in place an economy that not only will stimulate mining investment, but the two will serve each other. And we'll have this kind of mutually reinforcing partnership between European non-mining investment and private sector mining investment that will ultimately increase the quantity of production and therefore make more available to European partners. The bit that they haven't quite adopted yet, which is this is where it's very political, is that it is a political decision as to whether or not you put processing capacity onto the continent. It is not really an economic one. At the moment, the economic conditions for kind of beneficiation in Africa are limited. You need very cheap and accessible power. That's inconsistent across the continent. You need infrastructure for getting goods out. That's inconsistent. You need a reliable and accessible skilled workforce. That's inconsistent. So there's a lot of work to do to make some of these beneficiation ambitions a reality. I think that's where there's scope for some of this engagement. But like I say, it's a political decision rather than an economic one, because it will need some subsidization. Now, finally, let's talk about some of the others, because you've also got people like Saudi Arabia entering into the picture. You've also got the UAE, you've got Turkey. So, there's a huge range of both traditional and non-traditional partners who are now starting to engage on the mining industry in Africa, and particularly around critical minerals, where these aren't things that have traditionally made money through the cycle. They're not copper and iron ore, which you can produce at bulk, and then, low price rather, but high bulk, and so you can make money that way. They're not gold or diamonds, which have traditionally been kind of small volume but high price, although diamonds are struggling at the moment. These sit somewhere in the middle of that cost curve, and so it's a much higher risk than other parts of the mining industry, in much smaller volumes than other minerals that you would be producing. And so you can see these kind of smaller targeted investments by sovereign-backed mining companies, particularly from the Gulf, where, because it's backed by the sovereign, they're prepared to take that higher risk premium and knock out some of the other kind of Western private sector companies coming in. So again, a long answer for a complicated picture, but it gives us this idea that, from the US, it's a very kind of hard-nosed commercial approach to Africa on a multi-pronged approach. From the European Union, is much more kind of mixed markets, using what the state's resources to crowd in private sector investment. From other emerging players from the Gulf, it's about sovereign-backed, higher risk premiums, state-driven entities, and all of this against a backdrop of Chinese domination, which has largely been kind of state-backed Chinese control, and again, not necessarily strategic, but in terms of geopolitics, but has put itself into that position that is now what everybody is trying to challenge in different ways.
Well, Chris, you're currently in South Africa. If we look at all of this and the challenges to get this all going, it's because it all seems quite long term to get on the ground and get the negotiations. And even if you have a deal, as you say, to put the processing in place, is South Africa in a better position?
I am here in Johannesburg. I'm going to have to be very honest. The conversations that take place in South Africa at the moment, South Africa is the home of a lot of the mining industry for the continent in terms of the services that are provided, engineering, finance, and so on. A lot of those skills and expertise are clustered here in South Africa. So a lot of the conversations happen here in South Africa. But when those conversations happen, people are far more excited about other places on the continent than they are excited about South Africa. The South African mining industry has been struggling for quite a long time. One of the things that we're expecting to improve that, hopefully, is the new MPRDA, the new Minerals Act that has been out for consultation. The closure of the public consultation for that happened in the beginning of August. and now we're expecting kind of new regulation to come through. So miners in South Africa need regulatory stability and certainty, particularly where there are debates around, the point at which kind of national ownership and empowerment legislation would kick in. Is it in exploration? Is it in production? And so on. How much of a stake of a local entity is required to be handed over by an exploration company coming in? So there's those questions that need clarity. Beyond that, there's a process for tidying up the mining cadastre. This has been kind of heavily criticized for the last couple of years. It's huge kind of media kind of coverage of the problems of the cadastre system and the need for almost kind of a ground zeroing of, okay, who owns what? Now, this is for those who don't know, this would be an online portal that you can go into and you can see exactly who has rights over which piece of land. So who has prospecting rights, who's got exploration rights, who's got production rights, and so on, and what are those rights for, which particular metals are they allowed to be producing within that area, and so on. And this is something that South Africa has been trying to achieve, but the tidying up of this process has taken a really long time. So there's a problem in South Africa. The investment isn't coming in, and there is a need to turn around. Now, what is helpful, of course, is the mineral endowment that South Africa has. And it's not just, the gold and the platinum. It's also, manganese, ferrochrome, various other things that are considered critical by external partners, and that's why you've got increased European interest in South Africa, and part of the bargaining power that South Africa sees itself as having with the US, with its ongoing frictions with Washington. The relationship's at the worst, I think, that it's ever been. And yes, South Africa does have some things that it can use in that respect, but again, what it has is also available elsewhere. And so even if it's a dominant producer, it's got to think, well, how much of this stuff does the world actually need? So how much leverage do we have, and how do we attract investors in? And so remarks such as, oh well, if we're going to restrict our critical minerals exports to the US, they go down really problematic, because that just signals to the industry there's a risk that we might stop letting you take stuff out. Therefore, why would you ever want to come and invest in the first place? And the American perspective of the utilization of that leverage is almost like, if you imagine that you're in Joburg and Starbucks starts telling you, oh, we're banning you, we're not going to sell you coffee anymore. And Motherland Coffee is right next door, and they will sell you your favorite coffee. It's that kind of thing. You've got market choices if you're a buyer of these materials, much more so than you do if you're a producer who's looking to upscale its production rather than necessarily have a lot at the moment. So, the mining industry in South Africa is, it's at a moment where, things are being done, and particularly, as I say, around regulation and around the cadastre, they need to be got right, because there's a huge opportunity to turn the South African mining industry around, and there's a huge opportunity for it to be able to deliver going forward. But at the moment, it's really hard, and it is not seen as the big, sexy investment destination on the continent. Many more people interested in DRC, Angola, Zambia, Botswana, even Malawi. There's European strategic projects in Malawi. So South Africa can continue to be the host of these conversations. It can continue to be the place where everyone comes for their services and their skill sets and so on. But it needs to get the fundamentals right, including then the state-owned entities, and being able to support the industry through Transnet and through Eskom and through kind of power generation, or allowing companies to generate their own power. All of these things need to be got right, and what is a very delicate investment ecosystem. And if they are got right, there's huge potential. But at the moment, it's going to take a while.
Yeah, so and does South Africa know what it's supposed to do to change this environment, do you think? Are they keen to change it?
I think they do. I think that there's no shortage of policy advice and material being handed over to the ministry at the moment. It's not like there's a lack of awareness of these challenges or a lack of awareness of what needs to be done. I think that partly it's a case of political will of, okay, just how far do we want to open up, and what do we want to allow? And the other challenge I think that is faced is you've got, and it's linked to that political will part, the senior political leadership within South Africa know the industry incredibly well. President Ramaphosa comes out of the mines union movement. Gwede Mantashe also as the minister in charge. These are people who know the industry, but they know it as it was. They know it as it was in the kind of 80s and 90s when it was producing, when it was doing well, and when it was genuinely a potential vehicle for economic transformation. Where they are at the moment is it's an ideological question as well, and it's a difficult one for any government to have to face, which is, what role do we as the government want to play within this industry? Do we want to be an operator? Well, it's going to be hard because the capital available is pretty limited. So it's going to be hard to be an operator. Okay, what role do we want to have? In the coal industry, where Eskom buys so much of the coal, the state has an almost monopsony power over the coal industry. Monopsony meaning, single buyer. And so the state can enforce its requirements around economic transformation through being such an important buyer. To some extent, I think it sees other bits of the mining industry as well. This is owned by overseas investors. This is, this is beyond, this isn't something that we can, that is more difficult for us to engage with. But the bits of the industry, like the coal industry, where it has had more engagement, those are going to be in decline. And so it has to make this decision of, what role do we as the state want to play? And again, if you're coming from a background where you think that the state should have a very central role within the industry, that's fine, but you've got to set up your policies in a way that can continue to give that certainty to private sector investors, that they say, okay, this is what the state wants, and this is what it's going to commit to, and this is all it's going to do. And we as private operators can come and operate in this space, and we'll have that linkage in, and we know what the rules are. At the moment, no one really knows what the rules are because they keep changing. And that has meant that private investment has been going down and down and down. Private exploration boats been going down and down and down. And it's partly this, this really difficult question of, again, the state saying, what role do we want to play? Because clearly a purely extractivist industry that, reflects kind of, the worst elements of parts of the colonial era, where things are brought out of the ground and shipped overseas as quickly as possible with limited capital being reinvested internally. No one wants to see that happen, although questionable as to whether or not that was really the case in South Africa, because if you look around, you can see that the mining industry did start creating or it was really important for reinvestment of capital within South Africa, and particularly in Johannesburg and so on. And so that's not quite the accurate history on the South African side, but you can see that mentally people are like, we want to avoid this kind of purely extractivist industry. But how do we do that? And what role does the government play in doing that in a way that doesn't then spook private investors? And it hasn't got that balance right at the moment.
Well, Chris Vandome, thank you so much. Thanks for that deep dive, Chris.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.